Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and good morning for those of you joining us online around the world and in other parts of the country. My name is Shannen Brown. I am a business analyst and a member of the research and analysis team here at Standards Australia. It's my pleasure to moderate what will be an incredibly important conversation hosted by Standards Australia on the Metaverse and Standards. We are here at Standards Australia's offices in Sydney. So I'd like to begin this afternoon by acknowledging the traditional custodians on the land in which we meet, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and we pay our respects to elders past, present, and emerging. Today we're here to launch the exciting paper of the Metaverse and Standards Whitepaper. The Metaverse has been a topic of fascination and speculation for over 3 decades, ever since the term was coined by Neil Stephenson in his novel Snow Crash. With the rise of virtual and augmented reality technologies, the fully immersive virtual world has become more tangible and the excitement around the metaverse has grown. But how ready are we as a society to embrace the metaverse into our homes, into our communities, and into our day-to-day lives? What can we learn from past mistakes of the current form of internet? How might these lessons be applied to develop a safe and reliable metaverse? What risks do we need to address, and where do standards play a role? It's fair to say that the future development of the metaverse could signal a historic transformation where virtual and physical realities converge. With the launch of this Metaverse Standards Whitepaper, it signals a great opportunity for Australia to take the lead in supporting the safe and reliable deployment of the metaverse. Before we delve into these questions and before I introduce our lovely panelists, I would like to thank a few key people and organisations without who we would not be able to launch this event. A special thank you to our author of the Metaverse and Standards Whitepaper, Dr. Catriona Wallace, and the responsible Metaverse Alliance. We're lucky to have Catriona join us here today. A special thank you to our internal teams at Standards Australia for making this possible, notably our events teams and our research and analysis team. And a final thank you to the Department of Industry, Science and Resources for your support in publishing the Metaverse and Standards Whitepaper. I'm sure many of you will have questions that you'd like to ask, but we will have some time at the end for a Q&A. You will see a QR code on your screen, and for those online, you'll receive a link to enter the Slido chat, and you can submit your questions at any time throughout this discussion. And for those in the room, we'll be doing a traditional Q&A session at the end. So without further ado, I will introduce our lovely panel here today. I will start off with Daniel. Daniel Child is eSafety's Industry and Engagement Manager, overseeing online safety regulators' industry stakeholder engagement strategy and advancing its world-leading safety by design initiative. With the focus on proactive and systematic change, Daniel's team collaborate with the technology industry to make online experience measurably safer and more inclusive. Prior to joining eSafety, Daniel was executive manager at Australian data analytics firm Quantium, where he was responsible for delivering governance frameworks focused on topics such as ethical use of data, privacy, and cybersecurity. Welcome, Daniel. We're also joined by Kareen Riley-Takos. Kareen is the General Manager of Operations at Standards Australia, leading the organisation's standards development, publishing, technology and data functions. With over a decade of experience in the standards world, Kareen is actively involved in a various number of governance groups within International Organisation for Standardisation and the International Electrotechnical Commission to drive positive outcomes for the international communities that they serve. Welcome, Kareen. We're also joined by Dr. Catriona Wallace. Catriona is the founder of the Responsible Metaverse Alliance, chair of BOAB AI, an AI startup venture capital fund, and adjunct professor at UNSW, the author of Checkmate Humanity, The How and Why of Responsible AI, and is a shark on this year's Shark Tank series in Australia. We're also then finally joined by Lorraine Finlay. Lorraine is the Human Rights Commissioner at Australian Human Rights Commission and leads the work on the Commission in a range of areas, including technology and human rights. Prior to joining the Commission, Lorraine worked as a lawyer and an academic specialising in human rights and public law, with past roles including working as a senior human trafficking specialist with the Australian mission to ASEAN, a law academic at Murdoch University, and a state prosecutor with the Office of Director of Public Prosecutions. Welcome all, and thank you for being here. I guess my first question to kick us off, as I mentioned, the metaverse has been around for 30 years, with the first being coined back in 1992. There still remains intense excitement around the metaverse, but yet there's little consensus of its definition or its key components. Catriona, how do you define the metaverse, and what are some of its misconceptions?
Yeah, so the best way to think about the metaverse is it is a construct or a concept, and there is only one metaverse. So there's not a whole bunch of metaverses. And there are many, many definitions in the industry at the moment about what a metaverse is. We have some brilliant partners in the US, so XRSI, led by Kavya Perlman, and Kavya, for the purpose of this paper, Kavya has provided a definition, which I'll read out. But even Kavya's definition is different to our chief scientist, Dr. Louis Rosenberg, also out of California, who has a slightly different one. So I'll share both of those. And within those, we can pick out one or two kind of key themes. So XRSI note that the metaverse is a network of interconnected virtual worlds with the following characteristics: presence, persistence, immersion, and interoperability. And Lewis's definition is that the metaverse is a persistent and immersive simulated worlds that are experienced in the first person by groups of simultaneous users who share a strong sense of mutual presence. So who in the room understood a single word? No. So let's just boil that down. There's a couple of words there. So virtual world. So we know the metaverse is made up of a number of virtual worlds, and we know that there are at least 160 virtual worlds that are active currently. The concept of immersion is consistent in most definitions, and immersion means that you have a sense of really being in a different world. So the best way to think about where we are now is there's at least 3 different worlds we live in. The physical world, which we're in here now, the digital world, so those who are joining us online are experiencing us through the digital world, and the virtual world. And the virtual world is often accessed using virtual reality or augmented reality technology. So this sense of immersion. The sense of presence means that it feels very real. It's like you are present in this environment, just short of being this sense of presence in the physical world. Interoperability is the ability for the virtual worlds to interact and operate together. And then the final one is this sense of persistence. So it means if you go into a virtual world and then you leave the virtual world persists. It doesn't, just like some games, like online gaming, you might go in and the game does something because you're in it, and when you're not in it, it doesn't do anything. These worlds are persistent. If you're not in it, these worlds are still persisting.
Thank you, Catriona. It's a lot to take in, for sure. And I guess building on that point in terms of being the little consensus that you've just highlighted there as well, funnily enough, the Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers recently released a paper, and the paper reviewed in part articles and literature, and it identified 33 varying definitions of the metaverse. And then on top of that, there's a substantial amount of activity happening among standards development organizations, like you said, with the XRSI, with the International Organization for Standardization, and the Metaverse Standards Forum. So there's a lot going on. Kareen, what impact does this have on an emerging concept like the metaverse?
Well, I'd like to start by saying I think this is positive, even though it seems crazy. I think it's a positive that there's a lot of interest, and there are a lot of, brilliant and smart people trying to come back with definitions and standards. The challenge is that if you have a proliferation of organizations that are working on those, then you may end up with pick and choosing or lack of clarity, and, in a space or an environment where it's cross borders and we're all operating under the same basis, not having that well defined will be incredibly problematic. I would like to think that it's great that all of those definitions and also standards are popping up, but at some point there needs to be consolidation and broader agreement from a consensus perspective. Obviously, it's okay to start small and have kind of this pre-standardization concept of, what organizations or consortium that are taking the lead. But at some point, I think it would be incredibly valuable to actually have through, the multilateral organizations such as ISO, IEC, ITU, where it's one country, one vote, and there is broad consensus and agreement where, it's bedded down and it can be more widely used across all nations.
Thank you for that, Kareen. I guess, Lorraine, could you provide us then with some of the unique opportunities the evolving and expanding metaverse offers society?
Sure. And I think before that, one of the really key things to realise is while this discussion is going on about definitions, and as a lawyer, I know how important it is to properly define things, but the development of the technology hasn't stopped waiting for a perfect definition to be achieved. So in terms of opportunities and risks, I think we need to realise we have to be having multiple conversations at one time, and we have to be talking about the human rights impacts of this technology at the same time as we're talking about how do we define it, what standards can we create. And from an opportunities perspective, this is transformative technology. We talk a lot about the risks, and I know we're going to come to that, but the opportunities in terms of strengthening and uplifting human rights, bringing people together, overcoming physical limitations, there are huge opportunities, whether it be from areas like healthcare and education down to the perhaps, slightly more frivolous, but entertainment options. It is absolutely transformative. And as much as I am incredibly conscious of the enormous risks that are there, I don't want us to lose sight of the incredible opportunities that are there. And the way we harness those is by putting human rights at the very centre of the way we think about this technology.
And Catriona, is that something that, do you foresee similar opportunities?
Yeah, I am such a fan of virtual worlds. If I could spend hours and hours and hours a day, I would. I think the opportunities from everything from commerce right through to accessibility, a lot of problems that we have today may be solved with metaverse technologies. So opportunities are great. Risks, however, come from the fact that this is an ungoverned, unregulated, no laws, no policies, no standards world run by the tech giants. How's that gone for us so far? Not that well.
No, not at all. And in terms of then, like that on the flip side, Daniel, when we move from, or as we move from the 2D digital world to the 3D virtual world, what new risks does the metaverse introduce?
Yeah, pass to the regulator to talk about the risks. We know that there have been some well-publicised accounts of adults experiencing harms in metaverse environments. For example, Nina Jane Patel, I think, on Horizon World for a couple of minutes before being subjected to significant harassment. We at eSafety also know through our own research that children have experienced harms in the metaverse as well. In fact, around 1 in 5 children have experienced something in a metaverse environment which they felt put themselves at risk of harm. So the risks are there, they're real, they are developing over time. And I think what we really need to consider is the fact that these are very hyper-realistic experiences. So where we do talk about harms like harassment, cyberbullying, the impact of those can be really visceral, and they can be much more significant in terms of their impact, and that impact can be very long-lasting. Where we think about things like virtual reality games and potentially games with graphic content or very high violence type experiences, the type of feelings around trauma, anxiety could be so much more significant for children. And the combination of a virtual reality environment along with audio and even sensory experiences only contribute to a greater sense of harm.
Thank you, Daniel. And Lorraine, from your perspective, are there any other risks that you see, or are you aligned with what Daniel was saying?
Oh, I'd agree with everything that Daniel has said, but obviously there are other risks as well. And, I could run through a whole raft of them. One that jumps to mind is risk to privacy. And I think we're not talking about new risks. We're talking about existing known human rights risks that are exacerbated by the new context. And so what I think that means is we don't need to throw out our learnings that we've had over many, many years about human rights and the best way to respond to these types of risks. We just need to adapt to new circumstances. And as Catriona said, one of the biggest issues here is that we're putting those risks in a new context, but without any of the guardrails that we currently have in the physical world. So if we're talking about the heightened risk of sexual harassment, sexual abuse, sexual assault, we know how inadequate in the physical world our responses to those things often are. That's even worse in the metaverse because we don't have any of those shared understandings about who's responsible, where do you go for help, what are the limits, and people's inhibitions in the metaverse often disappear in a way that they don't in the physical world. So you're dealing with that heightened sense of who people are, which leads to behaviours that wouldn't be acceptable in the physical world but seem to somehow come to light in the metaverse.
And you mentioned actually, Lorraine, about, learning from past mistakes. Catriona, what can we learn from past mistakes of the internet, and what are some of the implications of a metaverse that is developed without reflecting and learning from these mistakes?
So one of the real challenges we will face with metaverse is the concept of identity. And as Lorraine said, there's a lot more opportunity to have a virtual identity that is separate to your digital or physical identity. And actually the top 3 reasons that people want to go and use the metaverse, one is entertainment, one is connecting with other people. The third main reason people want to use the metaverse is so that they can have an identity or persona other than their own. So identity is going to be a very, very challenging thing. How do we connect virtual, physical and digital identities? That is a huge challenge. But I think there will also be new challenges that we haven't yet conceived of. So I have been doing some work with the Australian Federal Police and New South Wales Police around their concepts of the metaverse and how you would police in the metaverse. And in fact, on the 6th of June, we're going to do a policing in the metaverse think tank. And one of the conversations the Australian Federal Police are having is the use of generative AI to drive automated avatars in what they call the dark verse, which is a dark metaverse, used to groom children, engage children in compromising activities, film it or record it, and then threaten the children with extortion with release of that on the internet or on the metaverse, and extorting money from children. And now we have laws and precedents for that, but in a way that can all just be automated. It doesn't have to actually have any humans involved in that. So it's this scale and the context makes this a very dangerous place.
And Daniel, is there anything you'd like to add to that?
Agree with all of Catriona's points. I would add to that as well, there is potential for a situation of a child wearing a VR headset, wearing a sensory suit, being on those devices in a bedroom with no oversight from parents. And again, going back to that point around sensory experience, they could be physically assaulted by bad actors operating in that way that Catriona just described. Alongside that question around digital identities and anonymity, I do also think there needs to be consideration around the role of age assurance or age verification of some type. And that's one of the challenges that the builders of the metaverse really need to contemplate at these early stages.
And I guess kind of not adding fuel to the fire, but in terms of Dr. Louis Rosenberg, who you briefly mentioned earlier, in his paper, The Metaverse, the Ultimate Tool of Persuasion, he notes that the metaverse could be the most dangerous tool of persuasion humanity has ever created. How do we design for trust and safety and guarantee those basic immersive rights in the metaverse? I might throw that one to you, Kareen, and then...
Yeah, look, I think the comments before about learning, from the lessons of the internet and everything that has come along, I accept that, there may be a lot of unknowns moving ahead, but we know the risks today. I mean, we're talking a lot about the risks here. And I think when you actually know the risks, we're well equipped to actually be able to at least put some safeguards, frameworks to deal with those. I love the approach about, safety by design. And it's really a cultural shift, particularly for the technology organizations that are building those environments and dealing with that technology, where it shouldn't just be about, let's just put something out there and see what happens. I mean, air tags, I think we all know, it was probably well intended, but then there can be misuse. How do you actually get those organizations and those that are actually putting out technology that is kind of life-changing somewhat, to actually think about those risks and actually be on the forefront of it and dealing with it? So I think the safety by design is a big one.
And Lorraine?
Well, I'd go one step further and say not only safety by design, but really putting humanity at the heart of this technology right from the very beginning, because we don't have tech for the sake of having tech. We have technology for the benefit it can lead for humanity, or the benefits it can offer for humanity. So the perspective of the Human Rights Commission is that we really need to be thinking at every single step along the way about what's the human impact of this and how are we going to take advantage of the opportunities but guard against the risks. And the only way you can do that is by understanding the risks right from the beginning. And I think the internet provides a really good example of that, because we're only seeing 20 odd years on some of those impacts, and we're trying to retrofit responses. We have a real opportunity now with the metaverse at the start of this journey to think about that ahead of time. And that's why the Commission thinks it's so important, for example, to sit down and do a proper assessment of what the human rights risks of the metaverse are. That's something we'd love to do from a human rights perspective, because unless you fully understand not only the risks in isolation, but how they work together, what the full impact is, how they affect particularly different groups, you can't put in place the appropriate protections that you need.
And Daniel, I'm keen to hear your perspective on that as well.
Yeah, it's great to hear Safety by Design getting a plug from the other panelists. But just to talk a bit more about the initiative, it's really focused on baking safety in rather than waiting for issues to happen and bolting it on later. It's underpinned by 3 core principles, one being service provider responsibility, and that really recognises that whilst new technologies do amplify opportunities, they also potentially amplify risks, and it should never be up to an individual to navigate those risks on their own. The second principle is user empowerment and autonomy, and I think it is really important that when we consider how the metaverse may be built in a safe way, the needs, wants, expectations of those who are going to use it, and particularly those sections of the community that are more at risk of harms, their opinions, their voices are taken into account in the design, development and deployment of those technologies. And the last principle is around transparency and accountability. And that's really the hallmark of building a safe environment, and hopefully can stimulate a race to the top in terms of safety features and the ways in which technology is designed. Principles are great, but they're not effective unless they're implemented in the right way. So Safety by Design also has some very practical risk assessment tools. They're available on the eSafety website, and they allow people involved in the development of technologies to actually think about the ways in which their services might be weaponized. And it really is taking that human-centric lens to things, thinking about how individuals might be impacted, but also considering those things that might be just not thought about in the standard development process, and really recognizing that people will be creative when it comes to using technology for bad. Unfortunately, that's the reality, and those risk assessment tools allow companies to work those scenarios through.
Thank you, Daniel. And Catriona, do you have anything to add?
I think we do need much more emphasis on human rights by design, because we have talked about safety by design quite a bit, and Julie Inman-Grant, who is Dan's boss, is a legend in being one of the first eSafety commissioners in the world. So I think that is very good. We must do that. But Lorraine and I have done a bit in the media over the last couple of months about human rights by design in technology, not just for how the tech is how it impacts, but how it's built. And we've seen some really bad examples of very poor human rights in the people that are actually contracted to build the technology, and that is a great worry to me. So the human rights by design needs to be from the inception right through to who it's going to impact, and we don't yet hear enough about that. So I'm absolutely backing Lorraine all the way that this needs to be top of mind for anything to do with this technology.
And then when discussing, Catriona, the needs for standards, in the Metaverse and Standards Whitepaper, you quoted the following from Tristan Harris, a technology ethicist. You said that when you invent new technology, you uncover new class of responsibilities. What areas of standards do you think Australia could lead in supporting these new classes of responsibilities to ensure that safe and reliable development and deployment of the metaverse?
Yeah, so this was a big question, and it was the big question for the purpose of the white paper. Because when we think about the jurisdiction for the metaverse, is it in New South Wales? Is it in Victoria? Is it in Australia? Is it in America? Is it international? It's not in any of those things. The virtual worlds have their own jurisdiction because they're virtual. They're like a different planet almost. So the big question is, who has the jurisdiction and where should the regulations or standards be applied? Question. We don't have that answer yet. However, we then went and we did an analysis, which some of it is covered in the paper, of what are all the bodies that are looking at standards, and even the Metaverse Standards Forum, which is based out of the US, but an international movement, has at least 35 different categories or areas that you could regulate or have policy or have standards, right? Because these are virtual worlds. It's like putting standards in this physical world we're in now, this massive. So what we focus on at the Responsible Metaverse Alliance, and this is really led by our chief scientist, Dr. Lewis Rosenberg, is this concept of manipulation. And so what we are calling for is Australia to double down on focusing on standards for targeted influence and manipulation of individuals in the metaverse, because we think this is the basis of where things will go badly, is that as we said, that immersive, persistent presence, the scale of it, the lack of jurisdictions mean individuals and the vulnerable are highly open to being manipulated. And so we think that's where the standards should focus from Australia. And there are 4 areas that in particular Lewis talks about. So one is the right for experiential authenticity. So that would mean if I'm in the metaverse and I'm approached by an avatar who is offering me a product, that I know whether that avatar is a virtual spokesperson with a virtual placement of a product, or if it is just a genuine, it's Lorraine in a headset coming up to show me, a great new drink that she's got, or if it is an automated AI-driven avatar. So the authenticity, am I dealing with a human here, or am I dealing with a robot? Am I dealing with a genuine person who's got a product, or is this a targeted advertisement? So that's one. The right to emotional privacy. So we know at the moment that if someone puts a VR headset on, within 2 minutes, the headset provider can identify who that person is just by the way they look and their body movements. So without having them even, know who they are through their login. It also detects their eye movements, if they're sweating, if they're hesitating on something. And as we go forward, there'll be more and more of this telematics, means that the tech providers of the hardware and the software can tell what emotion that person is having, and thereby target and influence them in ways that they don't even know. So that's the second one, the right to emotional privacy. The right to behavioural privacy. So this is then tracking people's behaviour, like we see currently on the web and social media, that the organisations trawl us, find out who we are, what we do, and then serve things up. So if you put that ability at scale in the metaverse, plus with the emotional identification of how a person behaves, that's very powerful to identify how to influence a person's behaviour. So we ask for the right for behavioural privacy, and then the right for human agency, that humans should be able to be free and safe and private and secure in the metaverse, And right now, we don't believe that's a thing. So we believe that an area for Australia to double down on would be standards related to the targeted influence and manipulation of individuals.
And Kareen, then following on from this, those recommendations, I mean, you know, in terms of where do you even start, but how can we ensure that we don't, or that we avoid standardizing prematurely to an immersive world that, you know, it hasn't been existing extensively and widely used?
Yeah, look, there's a long-standing debate as to whether, you know, standards stifle innovation or whether they're enablers. And obviously you can. I think if you look at standards as generally potentially being quite prescriptive and also kind of defining something that it's already established, it would kind of slow down in terms of innovation. But I do think that we're seeing rapid pace of change in a lot of areas where there needs to be a greater flexibility. And I think we need to rethink the way that we do standards for those areas, be a lot more, you know, less prescriptive, much more performance-based. What are the outcomes that we're trying to achieve? What are the methodologies or the frameworks that need to be applied? And that way you're not stopping innovation, but rather putting the safeguards or the right parameters around a particular emerging technology. And I think it can be done. And we were talking about these. So what happens next? We have the white paper and what happens next. And it's really exciting that we've been able, this work has been able to narrow down an area of focus where no one else is working on, because we don't want to have multiple standards. We don't want to necessarily kind of embark on technology standards for the metaverse, because we don't necessarily think that that's the area that Australia should be leading the work. But there is a real use case here and something that we would be very keen to kind of progress and help and you know, deliver to those needs.
Thank you, Kareen. I have one final question that kind of builds upon that for everyone before we open up to the firstly to the audience for a Q&A. What types of partnerships or collaborations then between industry and academia and government are necessary to drive such an initiative or use case? I might start off with you, Catriona.
Oh, yeah. So wouldn't it be nice if the tech giants wanted to partner on ethics and responsibility? That would be nice.
Yes.
But I'm not sure that that's actually possible. But we should certainly try for that. Other partnerships is looking for the really good players already in the international community. So one is XRSI, one is the Metaverse Standards Forum. We're seeing, I think, United Nations, World Economic Forum, all doing good work. So there are a bunch of organisations who are already starting to do work on policy, regulation and standards. So we should partner with those. But my call today is for the tech companies, and they're not all tech giants, some of them are tech startups, to come forward, approach us, to partner with us to develop these standards.
And Daniel?
Yeah, I'd absolutely agree with that. Safety by design isn't an approach that we foisted on industry. It was done in collaboration with industry, and we certainly recognise the innovation that exists in the technology industry. The collective brilliance can really bring about solutions, and so it's absolutely vital that industry is taking a lead. But we also need to recognise that their knowledge and lived experiences aren't complete, and they do need to take in that broad external stakeholder consultation. So having governments involved, having some of those working groups developing frameworks, the likes of XRSI, the World Economic Forum's Metaverse Governance Committee, and many others that are working on these really challenging problems with a multi-stakeholder approach. Just lastly, in terms of existing frameworks and regulation, it is worth mentioning that the Online Safety Act we have in Australia does encompass foundational metaverse platforms. So the likes of Roblox are covered under the Online Safety Act. And the metaverse platforms will also be covered by the industry codes or standards, which we're currently in the process of developing, those being industry-led and will be registered soon. So yes, there is more to do, but I do want to recognise that there is some legislation that applies to the metaverse already.
And Kareen, is there any?
Look, just adding, I totally agree with what they said, but also, because there is, as we talked about early on, a proliferation of standards development organizations that are getting in the space, I think rethinking the way that SDOs collaborate is quite critical as well, because we don't want to have, oh, hang on a second, I'm going to choose the French standard for these because it actually suits me better. We don't want that to happen. And I think just a rethink and working together with some of those standards development organizations will be really critical.
And finally, Lorraine.
I just absolutely agree and say partnerships are critical here, and put in a plug and say the Australian Human Rights Commission is always ready, willing and able to talk about this issue with anybody and to partner to ensure that we actually do get that human rights approach at every step along the way. But the other thing that I'd add is it's not only about partnerships between government, academia, civil society and tech companies, it's also about different sectors actually working together as well, because we actually need the data scientists to be talking to the lawyers, to be talking to the human rights experts, to be talking to the economists. We really need an approach that covers all of those different aspects to ensure that we get a full idea of what the benefits and risks are and can really come up with a comprehensive response.
Brilliant. Thank you, Lorraine. Moving to the Q&A, I see we have a few questions that have come through the Slido. So we have a question here. What are the panel's perspectives on an educational application or translation of Metaverse standards targeted towards eSafety for children? Who would like to?
Sure. Yes, yeah, I will have a crack at that. So education is a vital component of the overall picture in terms of building a safe metaverse. I think there's the education on the individual or the user side, so to ensure that children, in relation to this specific question, but also parents and carers are aware of the opportunities, but also aware of the risks, and those risks might be inherent in the experience on a platform. They might be related to equipment that's used to access metaverse environments. It's really key that the information is presented in easy to understand, digestible way, and it's able to reach diverse communities as well. And whether that's presenting in different languages other than English or making that information accessible in other ways, I think it's really important to consider the broad scope of individual users. On the other side, there's probably the education for industry. And I go back to that point around the understanding of how technologies might be weaponized. Those developing metaverse technologies may not be fully aware of that. And again, going back to those multi-stakeholder working groups and other partnerships where a very broad range of views and experiences can be taken into account, I think that contributes to a very well-rounded educational approach.
I have a crack. I get pretty charged up about this question. So we need education for everyone because we speak about metaverse, nobody knows what we're talking about, number one. Number two is we need experiential time. So how many in the room have actually been in a VR headset and had an experience in the metaverse? Few of you. And we'd expect that because you're here, right? Most people haven't. And you don't know what the metaverse is until you've had an experience. So I've been talking with Standards Australia, with Lorraine, with the Minister Husick, with Julie, Dan's boss, about setting up a metaverse experience centre where business and policy leaders can come in and have an experience, and it'll change your life. But with regard to children, this is the thing. We know that there are almost 500 million users of the metaverse in the world currently. We know that Roblox, which has at least 50 million monthly users, we know Minecraft, 350 million monthly users, are little metaverses, little virtual worlds. 2/3 of metaverse users are young people, so are children under the age of 16. The people that monitor those children are the parents. The parents know little to nothing about the metaverse. Most parents are, onto their kids about, you shouldn't be gaming, you should be out playing cricket or throwing a football or netball or eating an apple or something. Like, that is just so like yesterday. These kids need 10,000 hours of gaming to be the effective problem solvers in the future. If they're not banned doing it at home, they'll sneak out and do it somewhere else, right? So parents have got to come to the party and learn about the metaverse. It's like we've got a virtual world now, a world where your kids wander around and you don't even know it's there. Like, that's nuts. So I say, parents, go to your kids, get your kids to teach you Put your goggles on, get your own goggles, but don't be creepy. Don't be stalking them in Roblox or in Minecraft or in some virtual world. Don't be doing that, but learn from the children. And then the last thing I'll say, before Lorraine has got something beautiful to say, is teachers. Teachers are the custodians of the people who are using the metaverse, and teachers are actually pretty switched on to this. I've spoken to thousands of teachers and principals in the last 12 months, and they're all very worried. So I think we need to educate and enable teachers to be the custodians of the children who are the most vulnerable and the greatest users of the metaverse. Lorraine.
I would agree with all of that, other than I'm not going to tell my kids, so I just put new limits on their metaverse time that you've said they need.
10,000 hours.
We're not going to tell them that. But if I could just add two things. The first is that I think it's really important that we keep in mind we do have a digital divide here in Australia that's magnified globally. And one of the things that does concern me as this technology develops is we need to make sure we're not leaving people behind, particularly children behind, especially as this technology becomes more and more enmeshed with our day-to-day lives. So I think that's really important. And the second thing is going back to what you mentioned earlier, Catriona, about the particular risks in terms of people being able to be manipulated, the information that you can collect from a person. Those risks are magnified enormously when you're dealing with kids, particularly with kids who, when they get into new tech, want to explore and try things and be somebody different and have experiences that maybe they're developing and they're going to change their interests in, 5 years' time. To lock them into a digital identity that gives so much information about them when they're at such a formative stage of their development, there are so many risks that come from that. So I think we need to be really conscious in terms of thinking through the risks and the vulnerabilities around children, but not so conscious of it that we then stop them from being able to get used to this technology, develop the technology and become expert in it.
And in terms of them, we've just got another question that's after coming in. So because the metaverse won't be operated by just one country and users will be interacting with people from all over the world, this seems like the $1 million question. How can we ensure that standards or regulations are applied across borders? Who wants to take that one again? Poor Daniel.
Another one for me. I would point to some existing groups. So the Global Online Safety Regulators Network that Australia is a part of, along with a few others who have either implemented online safety legislation or in the process of doing so. That really provides a forum for coordinated efforts in recognition of the fact the industry that's being regulated is global in nature, and there's a high potential to create a splinter net of expectations and regulations, and wherever that can be avoided and efforts can be coordinated, that could only be of benefit in terms of industry understanding of what's expected of them, and also providing suitable remedies to individuals who experience harms online. I'm not sure, perhaps from that's kind of the regulations perspective, but perhaps there is a role for standards to be more coordinated across borders than regulation possibly can.
Yeah, look, absolutely. I think there is, obviously the standards are voluntary generally, but a lot of standards are referenced in regulations. And I'll come back to the point that I made before. You may have, thousands of organizations that are developing standards for the metaverse or any technologies that are applied within the metaverse. But regulators in particular tend to rely on the integrity and the robustness of the, ISO and IEC and ITU models, because it is that one country, one vote. It's a consensus approach. And it comes back to this point. It's industry-led, which you have a much greater chance of uptaking. I'm not suggesting that the standards alone are the answers to these, but I actually think that in a multilateral environment, you have greater chances of having regulators being, looking around and saying, actually, we have a standard for these. Why don't we all mandate this particular standard? Or it's just naturally that industries are going to start using it because people have expectations of a greater credibility or a certification scheme that will actually say this is, a responsible metaverse. It could be in some ways led that way as well. So there is a role here to be played. It is, as you said, Shannen, the $1 million question. You can develop the tool, but alone that's not enough to deal with the totality of the issues.
Can I add something very briefly? There is so much in this question I'd love to unpack, but I'll limit it to two challenges. And that is The first is the International Human Rights Framework has really been focused on the idea of countries as being your key actors. That's not the case here. And so I think we really need to start thinking more about that business and human rights framework and how do we get all of those different actors working together, which is enormously challenging. And I think the second thing is, we do have a universal set of human rights, and yet I think particularly recent events have shown not every country in the world necessarily shares the same understanding of how to prioritise those, how to apply those, what balance they think should be struck. So there are challenges in and of themselves in terms of applying human rights universally, let alone when we then add in the challenges in the metaverse that it's not just country-based. So I think the question is enormously important, and I wish I had a perfect answer, but I think I've just got more questions about it.
Catriona, do you have anything to add?
Well, I wanted to give an example so people sort of understand why this is a challenge. So I've been working with Crime Stoppers Australia, and Crime Stoppers figured the metaverse and went, we should put a Crime Stoppers office in the metaverse. I said, yeah, that's a great idea. Let's have a look at that. So there's a task group set up looking at this now, and then we kind of did a theoretical model. Okay, so let's put a Crime Stoppers. So there's Crime Stoppers New South Wales, Crime Stoppers Australia, Crime Stoppers International. But let's go Crime Stoppers Australia. Let's put an office in the metaverse somewhere. So let's put it in Horizon Worlds. That's Metas. Now, what if somebody experiences a crime and is walking along in their avatar with their virtual reality headsets on in their lounge room in Africa somewhere, and they're walking along and they're in Horizon World and they see, Crime Stoppers, I know that there's a crime, I'm going to go and report the crime. So in they go and they report the crime to the Australian Crime Stoppers person who's behind the virtual desk, and the crime actually didn't happen in the virtual world, nor did it happen in the digital world. It actually happened down their street in Nairobi where there's a drug den. And so they're reporting that in the virtual world, so it's not coming from the same world that it's been reported. It's not in the same country where the Crime Stoppers office thinks they are. What do they do with that? And so that raises this question about there's no international boundaries, there's no national boundaries, no state boundaries, but there's also possibilities that people would be doing things in the physical world that then are reflected in the virtual world. And there's little to no interoperability between the virtual world, the digital world, and the physical world. So it gets hugely complicated. And so Crime Stoppers is still looking at this like, how do we do that?
And that's why it's the $1 million question. So thank you, Catriona, for that example. So we'll move the questions to those in person. Does anyone have any questions that they'd like to ask our panelists? Yes, we've got a microphone coming your way. Don't worry.
And we'd love to know your name, please.
Hey, Stephen from Unity. I wanted to ask the panel just like a fun question. Like, where do you spend your time in the metaverse? Like, which platforms do you use?
I've been dreading that question because I was hoping I'd have a really intellectual answer that, is serious. And to be honest, I'm in there with my kids a lot gaming. So we spend a lot of time doing that, which is enormously fun, but a little bit embarrassing to admit in august company like this.
And I am a big proponent of the psychedelic renaissance. And so I spend time in an app called Trip, TRIPP, which is a meditation app, but it's like a full psychedelic experience. It's excellent.
Well, I don't play Roblox, but my kids are avid Roblox players as well. And as a mum, I'm constantly kind of hovering and trying to understand how it all plays out, just so I really get that glimpse and I'm not left behind either because it's fascinating.
My experience is probably a bit more boring. My children not old enough to play Roblox yet. Mostly my time in there has been spent in preparation or attendance of events. So on the likes of Horizon World, and often those events being coordinated through XRSI and similar organisations. So that's been my main experience.
I'll just throw one more in. So each month I do equivalent of a podcast, but in the metaverse with a woman called Julia Streets, who's based out of London. So we use Horizon workrooms, and we do like a metacast, really like a podcast in the metaverse, and it's called Metaverse What Matters. and it's super fun to do.
Thank you for that, Catriona. It's funny because I think when you said that before, you said it's super fun to do, but it's also very difficult to get set up and go in there.
Still pretty clunky.
And any other questions for those in the room? Yes. Oh, yep.
Chris Boddy from the Open Geospatial Consortium, geospatial information and so forth. How does that type of industry support your going forward in the metaverse and some of the regulations that you require from the physical mapping world into your environment?
Yeah, let me see if I can take that. So digital twin and geospatial mapping is going to be a core component of the metaverse, there's no question. And I am super pumped about digital twin and how that can be used, not just for buildings and infrastructure, but we're now seeing doctors being trained on the digital twin of a body rather than being using virtual reality, rather than being trained on a human cadaver. So there's a lot that can be done. So I think your sector, the geospatial mapping, anything to do with digital twin, is going to be a core foundational component of metaverse, and I'm very excited about it.
Thank you, Chris. Claire?
Hi, Claire Ripley from Standards Australia. My question's about the bright spots in the responsible metaverse. Like, what are some examples of where, you know, we might be getting it right in the smallest ways, or, you know, where are companies or governments or regulators or, just doing things that make you go, "Whew, okay, we've got this."
I think this conversation is probably one of them. You know, the fact that you are seeing from Australia the start of so many conversations, the Responsible Metaverse Alliance, Standards Australia being so interested in this. There are some really exciting initiatives coming from Australia that give me a lot of optimism about the role we can play as leaders in this field, not only in terms of developing the technology, but developing the responsible and ethical use of the technology.
And I'd say the other bright spots are in education. So seeing some of the education apps that are coming out for children, like imagine instead of reading like a history book on the Roman Empire, you put a headset on and you're walking through the streets of Rome and you're going into the buildings and you're eating the food. Like, it's extraordinary what will happen in education. And I think also in virtual health is going to be extraordinary. And these will be world-changing, life-changing, but also accessibility. So for people with disability to be able to put a headset on and then present as a fully abled avatar, amazing. To travel to places that you'd never be able to travel to physically. Accessibility, some beautiful examples.
I think we have time for one more final question, if there's anybody.
Troy Latta, Tech for Humanity. Fantastic conversation, really enjoyed it. And I just wanted to double down on the bright spots. Pick me some industries that we're not talking about. You know, we've talked about risks. We know the education is really important. But, you know, apart from geospatial, we haven't really talked about how it's affecting the businesses of Australia and how it's affecting the economy and all those other really boring things. But so pick a couple of answers where you think this is not only going to drive Australia and the Department of Standards and how we hold ourselves globally that way, but as a startup company, I'm interested in other areas that are emerging, and where will this take us as Australians in the next couple of years that we just haven't thought about yet? I want to be excited, Catriona.
Yeah. Well, man, I am so excited. You know that about me, Troy. I'm super pumped about this. Look, we've mentioned some which are not really businessy, so education and health. But with regard to business, what we're seeing is the partnering of unusual brands. So we're seeing Gucci partnering with Roblox. We're seeing Prada partnering with other gaming companies. So we're seeing the brands, the luxury brands, now accessing a whole new community of buyers, of purchasers in the virtual world. The most successful, highest revenued cosmetics company in the world, who would you think it would be?
Anyone?
L'Oreal, Chanel, Mecca, Boots Pharmacy. No, it's Fortnite Games. Fortnite sells $3 billion worth of cosmetics, in-game cosmetics and skins and things. more than any other cosmetic company in the world. So the opportunities for businesses, and it has been the luxury brands that have got in there cleverly first, but we know Accenture has an office in the metaverse, requires all of its new employees to spend 2 days in the metaverse. We know PwC is in the metaverse. We know Lend-Lease is in the metaverse. So we're starting to see these companies, some of which are Australia, starting to be positioned in there. We also wrote the New South Wales government's metaverse strategy, talking about what the New South Wales government would place in the metaverse by way of services and how they'd get metaverse ready. So I think there are bunch of, almost every industry can go into this and there will be opportunities for them.
But I think opportunities as well that we haven't really touched on in terms of training and development. I mean, I think of mining and resources. I mean, the opportunities to take big scale things that are just so difficult to do in the physical environment and put them in the metaverse. It just opens up so many possibilities. I mean, I've heard of that being done in the aviation industry, in the automotive industry. There are so many areas where this can be transformative, not only in terms of selling products on the metaverse and putting experiences on the metaverse, but taking your day-to-day business operations and transforming them through the way you engage with the metaverse.
I think that is a great way to end the conversation. So thank you to our panelists for providing us with such valuable and insightful notes on the evolving and expanding metaverse and the actions that we need to take in order to ensure we develop a safe, immersive virtual world. I would like to thank those joining online. I wish you a good evening or a good morning from wherever you're watching us this evening. And for those of you here, we'd love you to stay. I can imagine there's a few more questions that people would like to ask. So yes, thank you, everyone. Thank you.